George Byron, better known as Lord Byron, was born in London on January 22, 1788, to Captain John Byron, an officer in the British Royal Navy, and his wife, Catherine Gordon. He was born with a clubbed foot that caused him to suffer his whole life. His father married his mother for her money. After spending it all, he fled to France and died in 1791. When Byron was 6, his family moved to Scotland, where he grew up. He attended Cambridge until 1808, where he received his master's. He published his first collection of poems in 1807. In 1809, he left England and traveled in Greece and Turkey, where he wrote poetry about his experiences. His poems became widely popular in England, and in 1811 he returned to be acclaimed in literary circles. Although he was married and claimed to be an Anglican, Byron had numerous affairs and illegitimate children, one of which may have been with his half-sister. In 1816, his wife and daughter left him. He spent the rest of his life moving across Europe, writing his most famous pieces. Byron was a romantic poet who lived during the Romantic period of poetry. His works embody this, often involving things like nature, melancholy, imagination, and idealism. The Destruction of Sennacherib by Lord Byron was written in 1815 in his collection Hebrew Melodies. The morbid poem recounts the destruction of the Assyrian army by the god of the Hebrews, as described in the 32nd chapter of 2nd Chronicles. At the time, the king of Assyria was Sennacherib, thus the poem is titled The Destruction of Sennacherib. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed, and the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved, and forever grew still. And there lay the steed, his nostril all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gasping lay white on the turf, and cold as the spray of the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider, distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail. And the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal. And the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. The poem is organized into 6 quatrains consisting of 4 verses each. In the first quatrain, Byron immediately establishes the distinction between good and evil. The Israelites are described as the fold, and the Assyrians as wolves there to devour them. Biblically, the Israelites were favored by God as his chosen people, and Byron aligns his tone with that. The rest of this quatrain describes the vastness and beauty of the Assyrian army. This gives the impression that the Assyrians are a seemingly undefeatable foe. The second quatrain continues the description of the beauty and impressiveness of the Assyrian army, comparing them through simile to the leaves of the forest in summer. However, this is quickly contrasted by comparing them to withered autumn leaves the next morning. This marks the turn in the poem where Byron begins describing the defeat of the Assyrians. The third quatrain describes the angel of death spreading his wings, not to embrace or protect the Assyrian army, but to kill. There is no epic battle for victory, but instead the Assyrians silently pass in their sleep. Their weapons are useless against the wrath of the angel. The fourth quatrain morbidly describes a dead horse. Byron again uses a natural simile, comparing the foam of the horse's mouth to the cold spray of the ocean. This creates an image of death, defeat, and desperation. The fifth quatrain is interesting because of the emptiness it describes. The rider lay still, with the morning dew collecting on him. The camp of the Assyrians, that just the night before was glimmering in beauty, is now empty and silent. Usually, literature is full of action or drama. Byron creates a feeling of desolate emptiness and defeat by leaving that out. The final quatrain describes the widows of Asher wailing at the defeat of their army. Asher was the Assyrian god of war. With the army defeated, Assyria's god had been killed, leaving behind widows. The rest of the poem describes the victory of God and the Israelites over their enemies, namely the Assyrians and their gods. The poem is tightly constructed of 6 quatrains, or 4-line stanzas. It has an AABB rhyme scheme with rhyming units forming grammatical couplets, making each quatrain 2 equal phrases. This is significant because the poet uses this to demonstrate duality in the poem, with things like life, death, and summer and fall. Byron uses a meter of anapestic tetrameter, each line being made up of four sets of anapaests, which are made up of three syllables with an emphasis on the last syllable. Sometimes Byron substitutes an iambic foot for variety. Usually, he uses a perfectly regular anapestic form such as this. And the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea. Here, Byron uses alliteration with the four words beginning with the same letter. This gives a soothing feeling, which is appropriate, as the morbid section of the poem has not yet begun. While some may view this as a very morbid poem, which it is, we must also consider the poet's personal values and the time at which it was written, namely the Romantic period. At the time, Europe was very highly religious, and poetry like this would have been seen as the poetic recount of a biblical event displaying the God of the Hebrews' power and love for the Israelites, not as an account of death and gloom. While that would have certainly been an aspect, it would not have been the sole takeaway. To Byron, an Anglican from a Catholic household, it was a story of good overcoming evil. The Assyrians were there to conquer Jerusalem and kill God's chosen people. Instead, they were met with the might and wrath of God. To Byron, this was a story of divine power and protection. I believe he, being an Anglican, chose to write this poem to display the dichotomy of good and evil and tell this story to a broader audience. It also fit well in his collection of Hebrew melodies. I personally chose to cover this poem because it tells an interesting biblical story that is not talked about very often, using very descriptive and beautiful language despite the morbid content of the poem.